Hey everyone, are you ready for a deep dive into something really useful? Today we're tackling self-reliance and survival preparedness, and let me tell you, this is something a lot of you have been asking for.
Absolutely. It's a topic that's really resonating right now.
We're diving into Survival Guide, Preparing for Uncertainty by Conrad Riker. Have you had a chance to check it out yet?
I have. It's a fantastic resource. Riker really gets you thinking about those everyday systems, like power grids, transportation, or food supply chains, things we totally take for granted, and how fragile they really are.
It's true, we never really think about it until something happens.
Exactly.
Like I never really thought about a tree branch causing a massive blackout.
Right.
But then Riker brings up the 2003 Northeast blackout, one branch in Ohio, and 55 million people were suddenly in the dark.
It's incredible, isn't it? And it really highlights how vulnerable our interconnected systems are. And the thing is, it's not just about these large-scale events. Riker reminds us that even a localized emergency, something like a severe storm, a neighborhood power outage, anything like that can really disrupt our lives.
Yeah, it's about being prepared for those disruptions, big or small.
Exactly. It's about having that resourceful, adaptable mindset that allows you to thrive no matter what life throws your way.
So not becoming a doomsday prepper, but being realistically prepared.
Exactly.
I like that. So where do we even begin?
Well, one of the foundational elements that Riker keeps coming back to is physical fitness.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you need to hike to safety, build a shelter, or even just list heavy supplies, you've got to be physically capable.
Yep.
I really appreciated how he uses Arunima Sinha's story as an example.
Oh, yeah, she's incredibly
She's the amputee who climbed Mount Everest. Talk about inspiring.
It's a powerful example of what the human spirit is capable of, and it really highlights that limitations don't have to define you. And Riker breaks it down practically, too. He emphasizes both cardiovascular endurance and strength training.
So it's not just about looking good. It's about being functionally prepared for an emergency.
Exactly. It's about building a foundation of strength and resilience. And, it's not just about physical strength either. Riker dives deep into the mental game of survival, and this is where it gets really interesting. He calls it cultivating the survival mindset.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does that entail? Is it like channeling your inner Bear Grylls?
Well, there might be little Bear Grylls in all of us,
Maybe.
but Riker talks about mindfulness, being present, managing your thoughts, not letting fear take over. He has this one anecdote about needing to hand drill a stick for 10 minutes straight just to get an ember glowing to start a fire.
Oh, man.
And he said the key was just focusing on the rhythm, almost like a meditation.
Wow. That takes some serious mental fortitude.
It does.
It's about staying calm and focused under pressure. So how do we train our minds to be that resilient? So we're talking about cultivating a survival mindset. It's like,
Yep.
how do we stay calm and think clearly when everything's going haywire?
Right. It's about training your mind to be resilient, to find that inner strength, even in the toughest situations. And, Riker doesn't just talk about it abstractly. He
Yeah.
gets into some really practical wilderness survival skills.
Okay, so what are some of the things he recommends? Because I'll admit, my wilderness survival skills are a little rusty.
Well, one thing that really jumped out at me was his emphasis on shelter.
Shelter, okay.
He doesn't just gloss over it. He argues that having a well-built shelter can be the difference between life or death in a real survival situation.
It's true, we take shelter for granted, but yeah, being exposed to the elements can be really dangerous.
Absolutely. And he doesn't just tell you to build a shelter. He gets into the specifics, like take the debris hut, for example. He recommends building it with a steep slope on the back and sides to maximize rain runoff. He even talks about the importance of packing the debris tightly to create insulation. It's these little details that you wouldn't think about, but they can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's understanding the why behind the what, right? It's not just about piling up leaves, it's about understanding how to create a structure that will actually protect you.
Exactly. And that attention to detail is crucial when it comes to water, too.
Water, right, that's critical.
Riker uses this incredibly vivid language about how you never realize just how vital water is until you are completely and totally out of it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Every cell in your body screaming out for it.
Okay, so finding water is one thing, but then making sure it's safe to drink is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So what are some of the tips that he gives about sourcing and purifying water?
Well, he gets into everything from digging a seep well near water sources to collecting morning dew, even using a plastic sheet and some vegetation to create condensation, which is super helpful in arid environments.
Oh, wow.
But of course, finding water is only half the battle, right? You've got to purify it.
Right, because even crystal clear water could be full of bacteria.
Exactly. Boiling is obviously the most reliable method, but he talks about solar stills for when fuel is scarce, water purification tablets.
Good backups to have. Okay, so we've got shelter, we've got water. What about food? I'll admit the thought of foraging for bugs doesn't exactly sound appetizing to me.
Right.
But Riker seems to think it's a viable option.
He does, and you know what? He actually makes a really compelling case for it.
Okay.
Insects are a great source of protein. And in a survival situation, you've got to be open to unconventional food sources.
That's true. Okay, I'm trying to keep an open mind here.
That's the spirit.
But does he actually give practical advice on what to look for? How to forage safely? I mean, I wouldn't know a poisonous plant from a delicious one.
Right. Well, he really emphasizes the importance of observation and cautious experimentation. Like, for example, observe what the animals are eating. That's always a good clue.
Okay.
And always test a small amount of any plant first to see if you have any kind of adverse reaction.
That makes sense.
Don't want to go eating a whole bunch of something you've never had before, right?
Not unless you know what it is.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the basics. Shelter, water, food. But what about navigating the challenges of like an uncertain world, but in a more general sense?
Right. Well, one thing that Riker dives into that I found really relevant is firearms.
Okay, yeah, that's a topic that always sparks a lot of conversation, for
Yeah.
sure. What's Riker's take on firearms?
He approaches it with a lot of nuance. You know, he acknowledges that firearms can be a valuable tool for self-defense, especially in remote areas or during times of unrest. But he's also very clear about the huge responsibility that comes with owning and using a firearm.
So it's not about like glorifying guns or promoting fear-based gun ownership.
Not at all. He emphasizes things like safe storage, proper training, and regular practice. Because if you're going to have a firearm, you need to know how to use it safely and responsibly.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Okay, so being prepared for the worst, but also approaching it with caution and respect. Speaking of being prepared for the worst, what about communication breakdowns? I feel like in our hyper-connected world, it's easy to forget how reliant we are on technology.
It's so true. And Riker uses Hurricane Katrina as a prime example of how quickly communication networks can collapse during a disaster.
You know, people were stranded without a way to contact loved ones, call for help.
It's a scary thought. So, okay, what's the solution? Are we going back to, like, carrier pigeons and smoke signals?
Well, Riker doesn't quite go that far back in time,
Yeah.
but he does talk about the pros and cons of different communication methods for when the grid goes down.
Like what?
So ham radios, they're incredibly reliable, but they do require a license and some technical know-how.
Right. Okay, what about walkie-talkies? I feel like that seems pretty simple.
Yeah, and he likes walkie-talkies for their ease of use, but the range is limited, so that's something to keep in mind.
Right.
And then, of course, there are satellite phones, which, pretty much guarantee global communication, but they can be pricey. Right, right.
Yeah.
It is amazing how essential communication is in a crisis. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just about, like, staying connected. It's about accessing information, coordinating help.
Absolutely.
It can even provide, like, a sense of hope in a really difficult situation.
It's huge.
Okay, so we've talked about communication. What about, like, medical emergencies?
Yes. Riker dedicates a whole section to medical preparedness.
That's a big one.
Huge.
Because I feel like a lot of people, they might have a first aid kit, but they don't really know how to use it beyond a Band-Aid.
Exactly. And, his approach goes beyond just having a well-stocked first aid kit. It's about knowing how to use what's in it.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, it's one thing to have a tourniquet, but it's another thing entirely to know how to use it properly to actually, potentially save a life. So how does he suggest people gain those skills?
Yeah. Well, he's a big advocate for taking a first aid course. He also recommends, learning how to splint a broken bone, treat burns, just basic wound care. Because in a real survival situation, you might be the only one who can help.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also kind of empowering in a way
It is.
to realize that we have the ability to learn these skills and to take care of ourselves and others. This conversation is really making me rethink my own level of preparedness.
It's eye-opening, isn't it?
So we were talking about some of the other stuff that Riker talks about in the book, like financial independence, long-term planning. It seems like those are almost like taboo subjects these days.
They are.
Like, we're so used to instant gratification, just thinking about the short term, you know? So how does Riker approach those concepts in the context of being prepared?
Well, he kind of ties it all back to that core idea of self-reliance. He's saying that true preparedness isn't just about having a go bag and a stockpile of supplies. It's about building a life that's resilient.
So not about being a millionaire overnight, but creating a life where you're not living paycheck to paycheck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about the importance of diversifying income streams.
Oh, interesting.
Like, he uses the 2020 pandemic layoffs as a perfect example of why having all your eggs in one basket can really backfire.
Yeah, so many people were really caught off guard when all of a sudden they didn't have a job anymore.
Yeah.
So having like multiple streams of income, even if they're small, it's kind of like a safety net.
Exactly. And, he doesn't just leave it at that. He actually gets into some really practical steps, like learning new skills, starting a side hustle, exploring different investment opportunities.
It's taking control of your financial future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that you're less vulnerable if, the unexpected happens.
It's funny how, like, preparing for an economic downturn isn't all that different from preparing for a natural disaster.
Totally.
It's all about anticipating those vulnerabilities and just being more resilient.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us to another key element of Riker's approach, which is long-term planning,
Okay.
especially when it comes to, food and resources.
Okay.
He's a big advocate for learning about food storage and preservation techniques.
Okay, so we're not talking about hoarding here.
Right.
Because there's a big difference between being prepared
Yeah.
and just stockpiling a bunch of stuff out of fear.
Exactly. He actually addresses that directly. He's not talking about like building a bunker and disappearing from society. He's talking about building up, a reasonable supply of non-perishable food, learning how to preserve fresh produce.
Your own garden.
Yeah.
Or raising chickens.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for your own needs as much as you can. He tells this really interesting story about how his water purifier broke down on him in the middle of a backpacking trip.
Oh, no.
In the Rockies, no less.
Yeah.
And he had to rely on these backup purification tablets. But it was a good reminder that even the most reliable equipment can fail.
Yeah, it's good to have like a backup plan for your backup plan.
Exactly.
So that's saying 2 is 1 and 1 is none.
I like that.
So, we've talked a lot about the practical stuff, like the skills, the supplies, but I'm also really curious about the human element of survival and like how do we deal with the ethical challenges that might come up in a crisis.
Right.
Like, I know that Riker talks about the Stanford prison experiment.
He does. It's such a powerful but also disturbing example of how quickly power dynamics can shift, even among, quote unquote, ordinary people.
Right.
And he uses that example to kind of highlight the importance of what he calls moral preparedness, which is not something we often think about.
Yeah, what does that even look like?
Yeah.
Is that like having a set of rules for every possible scenario?
It's more about, I think, cultivating empathy and compassion, having that strong sense of ethics. It's thinking through those what-if scenarios. Like, what if you came across a limited supply of food and water after a disaster and asking yourself, like, what are my values?
Right.
How do I want to show up in this situation?
It's about making those conscious choices, even when things are really tough.
Exactly.
And what about, like, the divide that we often see between, like, preppers and non-preppers? Seems like Riker's a big advocate for, kind of bridging that gap.
He is. He really challenges that stereotype, of the paranoid prepper. He makes the point that preparedness is really about taking responsibility, not giving in to fear. And, he shares this great example of a community up in Idaho that actually came together to prepare for wildfires. But they didn't do it by, like, fear-mongering.
Right.
They did it through, workshops. They created these great resource guides. They even had, like, a community preparedness day.
It's like empowering people, not scaring them.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That makes me think about community. That's a whole other aspect of preparedness that I feel like we haven't even really touched on yet. What are Riker's thoughts about that?
Yeah, he dedicates a whole section to community building, and I think it's one of the most important takeaways from the book. He argues that in a true survival situation, having a strong community can be just as important as, having food, water, any of the physical supplies.
Well, it makes sense. We're social creatures.
We are.
Like having those people to rely on, to share resources with for emotional support.
It makes all the difference.
That human connection.
Huge.
It's really powerful.
It is. And, he also emphasizes that building that kind of resilient community it takes time. It takes effort.
Oh, for sure.
It's about finding those like-minded individuals, building trust, establishing shared goals and values.
It makes me think about all those stories that we hear after natural disasters about, strangers helping strangers, neighbors sharing what they have, communities coming together to rebuild.
It's incredible.
It really is a testament to, that human desire to connect and help one another, even when times are really tough. Wow, we covered so much ground today, from practical wilderness skills to financial stuff, mental resilience, community.
Excellent.
Riker's book really gives us a very well-rounded perspective on what it means to be prepared for anything.
It really does. He kind of reframes the whole idea of preparedness.
Yeah.
It's not like a destination, it's a journey.
It's a process.
It's ongoing.
And the beauty is you can start wherever you are right now.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter your experience level or anything like that.
It's about taking that first step.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired and want to take that first step, what's something concrete that they can do, like today, to start their own preparedness journey?
That's a good question. I would say start by identifying, like, what's your biggest area of vulnerability? Is it financial security? Is it, food storage? Lack of first aid knowledge? And then just take one small step to address it.
One thing.
Just one thing.
Lovely.
Even that little bit of effort can make a huge difference.
It's about turning knowledge into action.
Yes.
And that's what we're all about. That's what this deep dive is all about.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, it's not about being scared. It's about being prepared. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there.